A bit of snowfall can feel romantic, like in the movies, but when the snow doesn't stop falling, everything quickly turns into a tragedy. The initial white beauty soon transforms into a wall of imprisonment, completely isolating cities and turning warm homes into cold fortresses. Today, we will look back at 10 of the most devastating blizzards to ever submerge America. The Northeastern Blizzard of 1978. Monday, February 6, 1978 was just an ordinary start to the week for millions of Americans in New England. The morning weather forecast only mentioned a few light snow flurries. Suddenly, by midday, the sky collapsed into a slate gray, and snow began to pour down like a waterfall. Winds began to howl at sustained speeds of 50 to 70 miles per hour, with gusts reaching 100 miles per hour in some places. Atmospheric pressure dropped so deeply that experts called this a tropical storm in the frost. The real tragedy began when the afternoon rush hour hit. On Interstate 95, the vital artery connecting major metropolitan areas, thousands of drivers were trapped in freezing vehicles. Visibility quickly dropped to zero, turning the world outside the glass into a thick, murky white fog. In a desperate effort to maintain warmth, many drivers kept their engines running, unaware that the snow had risen above the level of the exhaust pipes in the back. When the exhaust gases had no way to escape, they were silently forced back into the cabin, creating a death trap known as carbon monoxide gas. Consequently, 14 people were confirmed dead from carbon monoxide poisoning while trapped in their cars. More than 3,000 cars and trucks were abandoned right in the middle of the highway when their owners realized they had a choice: either walk into the blinding night to find help, or be buried alive on the spot. Residents living near the highway became accidental heroes, opening their doors to take frozen strangers into their homes and turning their living room floors into temporary rescue centers. This intense destructive power forced the government to declare a car travel ban that lasted over a week across the entire state, something unprecedented in modern history. As engines became useless, skis and snowmobiles became the dominant modes of transportation. Those lucky enough to own specialized snowmobiles suddenly became saviors, weaving through every street corner to deliver medicine and food to the isolated elderly. A powerful sense of community connection arose from the disaster. Neighbors dug tunnels through towering walls of snow to share warmth, along with cans of tuna, candles, and batteries. In coastal Massachusetts, record-breaking waves caused by storm surges ripped through wooden houses, sweeping them out into the ocean. In the darkness of the total power outage, residents could only hear the sound of wood shattering and the roar of the sea. Meanwhile, in Boston and Rhode Island, snow layers tens of inches thick created drifts that buried the first floors of houses. The blizzard of 1978 passed, leaving behind a lesson in respecting the sky and exposing the fragility of modern systems. The Appalachian Storm of 1950. Thanksgiving in 1950 was expected to be the most brilliant chapter of the post-war American dream. In brand new suburban kitchens, middle-class families were excitedly preparing dinner with roasted turkey and modern electric ovens, symbols of prosperity and convenience. However, in that very warm moment, nature unleashed a meteorological bomb called the Appalachian Storm, extinguishing all pride in just 1 week, from November the 24th to 30th. This fury had two completely different faces on either side of the mountain range. To the east of the Appalachians, people watched in horror as torrential rains accompanied by wind gusts of up to 160 miles per hour occurred. This speed is equivalent to a Category 5 hurricane, powerful enough to tear off sturdy roofs and turn wooden utility poles into splinters. Meanwhile, to the west, a wall of white covered everything. In West Virginia, record snowfall reached 57 inches, nearly 1.5 meters, turning every path into an icy valley with no way out. The power of the Appalachian Storm knew no geographical limits as it swept across 22 states, occupying nearly half of the United States. Its extremity even reached down to the sunny south, where residents were completely unprepared for the biting cold. In Jacksonville, Florida, the temperature dropped to 20 degrees Fahrenheit, leaving coconut trees and orchards heavy with fruit covered in a strange frost. This was the first time in modern meteorological history that a winter storm was simultaneously labeled by the press as the storm of the century because of its fierce scale of destruction. 383 lives were taken, too high a price for nature's surprise. Men collapsed from exhaustion while trying to shovel snow to clear the way. The elderly died from the cold in dark rooms, and traffic tragedies occurred when visibility was zero. Not stopping there, the rapid rise in temperature after the storm created a secondary disaster that was even more terrifying: widespread flooding. Millions of tons of snow melted at the same time, turning peaceful rivers into murky water monsters that flooded residential areas and washed away what remained after the storm. The combination of ice and flooding created a pincer that strangled the northeastern states. After this disaster, America carried out a revolution in meteorology so that it would never be ambushed by a similar meteorological bomb again. The government began pouring massive resources into modernizing the warning system. This was the milestone that led to the use of the first electronic computer, ENIAC, to simulate weather models and establish a more synchronized remote monitoring network. Have you ever heard a relative recount memories of a historic blizzard? Or have you personally experienced moments of isolation in the darkness? Please share your story in the comments. The Chicago Blizzard of 1967. Chicago has always prided itself on being a resilient industrial machine, a proud metropolis that never bowed to the freezing winds whistling across Lake Michigan. However, the morning of January 26, 1967, proved the opposite. The meteorological bulletin at dawn only gave a subjective forecast of a few light snow flurries. Millions of residents still casually drove to work, and children eagerly went to school. No one could have anticipated the terrifying natural disaster they were about to face. The tragedy began to erupt in the middle of the day. Tiny snowflakes quickly turned into a white fury. Although the measured snowfall was 58 centimeters, a figure that seems modest compared to many other great storms, the sustained wind speeds of over 50 miles per hour were the real killers. The entire city of Chicago was besieged by giant walls of snow, up to 20 feet high, equivalent to a two-story building. On Michigan Avenue, the bright red buses, symbols of Chicago's public transportation, were now only visible at the roofline, sitting silently like sunken hatches in a white ocean. Because the storm hit so suddenly while everyone was at work and school, panicked evacuation took place. As a result, 50,000 vehicles were abandoned on the roads, turning vital highways into endless iron and steel graveyards. O'Hare Airport had to close for the first time in history because of snow. Amidst the complete paralysis of modern vehicles, Chicago was forced to return to the most primitive survival instincts. Between the skyscrapers of glass and steel, people began to see snowmobiles and skis gliding hurriedly. Strangers had to hold hands in long lines to fight the force of the wind, trying to return home in the murky night. This fury took the lives of 60 people, leaving behind a devastated city that required 3 weeks of relentless effort to clear away the snow. The bitter failure of 1967 forced this city to carry out an unprecedented reform. The Chicago government poured millions of dollars into building a giant snow removal army with hundreds of modern bulldozers and salt spreaders, ensuring this disaster would not happen a second time. Cleveland. Superbomb, 1978. Just 10 days before the Northeast collapsed under a white deluge, the state of Ohio became the epicenter of a phenomenon that meteorologists called by a haunting name, superbomb. This was not an exaggeration. On January 25, 1978, a literal pressure explosion occurred in the sky over the Ohio River Valley. In less than 24 hours, atmospheric pressure plummeted to a level of 956 hectopascals, the lowest ever recorded on the U.S. mainland at that time for an extratropical storm. This sudden drop created a massive suction force, turning the Great Lakes region into a battlefield of ice and swirling winds. The power of this superbomb far exceeded all conventional standards for a winter storm. Wind shrieked across the fields of Ohio and Michigan with the power of a persistent tornado, enough to lift and blow away train cars weighing tens of tons off their tracks. The combination of the biting cold and wind gusts pushed the wind chill down to a terrifying threshold, minus 60 degrees Fahrenheit. At this temperature, human skin would freeze in just a few minutes of exposure. Historical context at the time further increased the tragedy. Ohio was struggling with a record-breaking harsh winter, and this storm was the final knife that took down all defensive systems. 90 people were killed, including 52 who died from freezing inside their own homes or cars when the heating systems were completely paralyzed. The city of Cleveland was isolated in a deadly silence, where every transportation artery was blocked by walls of snow as hard as rock. For the first time, the National Guard had to deploy specialized armored vehicles and military helicopters to reach remote communities that were cut off from communication. Soldiers had to fight in zero visibility conditions to bring essential supplies to the elderly huddled in the darkness. This storm taught the people of the Midwest about the true meaning of resilience and courage, turning the winter of 1978 into a heroic and tragic chapter in Ohio's history. If you feel that these documentary films and stories of these great blizzards are truly impressive, don't forget click the hype video button. The Great Blizzard of 1966. At the end of January 1966, an eerie silence fell over the southeastern United States, spreading all the way to the Canadian border. It was not an ordinary deep freeze, but the beginning of a siege that lasted for 4 consecutive days and nights, from January 27th to 31st, 1966. History calls it the White Hurricane, a silent meteorological entity that possessed destructive power, turning modern cities into deserted islands in a vast ocean of thick snow. The most terrifying highlight of this storm was in the state of New York. The devastating combination of a strong low-pressure system and the lake effect from the Great Lakes created an unimaginable scenario. In some areas of central New York, snow accumulation reached insane levels, 103 inches. Imagine opening your front door in the morning and facing a white wall higher than a person's head, completely sealing off every exit. The entire transportation infrastructure of the Mid-Atlantic region collapsed in just a few hours. The strength of the storm created whiteout conditions, a state of zero visibility where the boundary between the ground and the sky completely disappeared. In that murky snow mist, hundreds of trains lost steam and stood still in the middle of vast fields. Giant steam locomotives were buried up to their chimneys, becoming solitary iron carcasses on the white plains. Passengers trapped inside had to face the biting cold as heating fuel gradually ran out, while rescue forces were completely helpless, because they could not determine the location of the trains in the blizzard. However, in that extreme harshness, the human community spirit shone the brightest. Although stepping outside became an impossible task, the need for survival and concern for neighbors drove residents to implement an extraordinary solution: digging tunnels. Under the thick layers of snow, neighbors worked together to dig paths through the white underground, to share every piece of bread, every bottle of milk, or simply to check if the house next door had survived. These ant networks made 5 Points or working-class neighborhoods feel unusually warm in the heart of the frost. But the price of survival in 1966 was very expensive, with 201 deaths. Even more painful was the passing of 40 victims related to house fires. In desperate search for warmth when the power grid was cut off, many families used primitive and unsafe heating methods such as old stoves or oil lamps in enclosed spaces. Flames erupted in the cold of the night, but firefighters could not reach them because walls of snow blocked every entrance. After this storm, the use of makeshift heating devices was placed under strict supervision by fire protection agencies, NFPA. The Great White Hurricane, 1888. In March 1888, the people of New York were eagerly awaiting the first warm rays of spring sun. But their world was completely turned upside down in just one night. On the morning of March 11th, the sky suddenly collapsed into a gray fog, signaling the arrival of the Great White Hurricane, the most devastating blizzard ever recorded in U.S. history. The power of nature that year lay in the deadly combination of freezing temperatures and hurricane-force wind gusts. For 3 days and nights, snow fell relentlessly, accumulating up to 127 centimeters on flat ground. Strong winds molded the snow into giant walls up to 15 meters high, completely covering second-story houses. New York, the center of modern civilization at the time, suddenly became a wild island. The isolation was so bad that the New York Stock Exchange, and NYSE, the financial heart of the world, had to close for 2 consecutive days. This was an unprecedented event, an economic standstill that history would not repeat for over a century until Superstorm Sandy in 2012. Amidst the blizzard, major fires broke out due to electrical shorts or overturned oil lamps in the slums. However, fire alarms became futile as horse-called fire engines were buried in snowdrifts higher than a person's head. Firefighters could only watch as the flames burned down blocks of houses in the middle of the icy night without being able to take a single step further. More than 400 lives were lost in this great storm. The image of frozen bodies right on the sidewalk, hidden under the white snow just a few steps from their front doors, became the most terrifying nightmare of that era. Offshore, the hurricane turned the Atlantic Ocean into a massive graveyard. More than 200 ships capsized or sank completely, turning fateful voyages into cold water graves. Even the bravest sailors could not fight against the combination of building-sized waves and zero visibility. However, from the ashes and ice of 1888, a new urban vision was born. Americans realized that their modernity was too fragile when all the vital systems, from power lines and telegraph wires to transportation, were exposed to nature. This storm became the historical push that forced the New York government to make a bold decision: move the entire electrical network underground to avoid being broken by storms. 6 years after the disaster, New York officially passed legislation allowing the use of public funds to build an underground subway system. And 16 years after that, in 1904, the first official New York subway line opened, running from City Hall to 145th Street. This system allowed the transportation of thousands of people per hour without being affected by even the largest blizzard. If you want to continue accompanying back to yesterday on next nostalgic journeys, don't forget to subscribe. The Storm of the Century, 1993. If 1888 was a surprise attack on people walking the streets, the storm of March 1993 was a giant entity that humanity observed fully from orbit for the first time. When satellite eyes looked down from space, what they saw was not sparse clouds, but a swirling white vortex wrapping around the entire east coast of North America, stretching an icy ribbon from the Canadian Arctic down to the white sands of Cuba. With a scale sweeping across 26 states, this was a true meteorological monster, directly affecting nearly half of the U.S. population at that time. The power of this storm lay in the strange intersection of extremes. In high mountain areas like Mount LeConte in Tennessee, snow fell in an insane amount of up to 56 inches, about 1.4 meters. But what really shocked scientists was the way it invaded the South. Residents of Birmingham, Alabama, who were used to sweltering heat, suddenly found themselves buried under 13 inches of snow. A surreal phenomenon turning southern pines into giant, real-life Christmas trees. Even Florida, where people knew only sun and sea breezes, watched in horror as snow fell right on the palm fronds. Americans realized that their modernity was too fragile when all the vital systems, from power lines and telegraph wires to transportation, were exposed to nature. This storm became the historical push that forced the New York government to make a bold decision: move the entire electrical network underground to avoid being broken by storms. 6 years after the disaster, New York officially passed legislation allowing the use of public funds to build an underground subway system. And 16 years after that, in 1904, the first official New York subway line opened, running from City Hall to 145th Street. This system allowed the transportation of thousands of people per hour without being affected by even the largest blizzard. If you want to continue accompanying back to yesterday on next nostalgic journeys, don't forget to subscribe. Help the death toll stop at 318 people, a painful number but still lower than the 1888 disaster, despite the 1993 storm being far larger in scale. The Great Lakes Storm of 1913. In American maritime circles, there is a phrase that always causes fear as winter approaches: the November Witch. That is the name for the fierce hurricanes formed by the intersection of cold, dry polar air and the residual warmth on the water of the Great Lakes system. However, never in history has this witch been as cruel and powerful as the days from November 7th to 10th, 1913. This storm was a great massacre on freshwater, shaking the entire water transportation industry of the United States. It all started with the deception of the sky when the wind was calm and the lake surface was smooth, urging captains to carry out the last shipment of the season. But within hours, a massive low-pressure system collapsed, turning the inland lakes into a raging ocean. Wind gusted up to hurricane force, shrieking through masts and chimneys with enough power to tear through thick steel. The most terrifying thing was the waves. They were not like long, steady ocean waves, but vertical, surging columns of water as high as a 3-story building. Giant cargo ships hundreds of meters long were lifted into the air and tossed into the heart of the lake like toys. History records a tragic scene. 12 large ships were completely submerged, leaving no trace of lifeboats. Every lake in the Great Lakes system, from Superior to Ontario, recorded at least one large-scale shipwreck. Most special was the case of the ship Charles S. Price. People found it floating in an overturned state in the middle of Lake Huron, but it took several days to identify it because the entire hull was covered by a thick layer of ice. This great hurricane caused more than 250 sailors to lie forever under the icy water. Those lucky enough to drift ashore could not escape death either, because they froze as soon as they touched land in their soaking wet clothes. Besides the disaster on the water, the storm also dumped blinding snow, completely paralyzing lakeside cities like Cleveland and Buffalo. The 1913 storm forever changed maritime safety rules in America, leading to the creation of specialized storm forecasting systems for the lakes region. It also encouraged the redesign of cargo ship structures on the Great Lakes to withstand greater longitudinal bending stress from short waves. To this day, the 1913 storm remains a massive shadow, reminding us that even peaceful inland lakes can become a cold graveyard when the November witch wakes up. If you find these nostalgic films impressive, don't forget to share this video with your friends. The Great Blizzard of 1996. In the mid-90s, when the world was preoccupied with the first steps of the internet and grunge culture, nature sent a cold reminder of its primal power. In the early days of January 1996, a meteorological monster called a nor'easter formed off the East Coast, carrying all the aggression of a tropical storm, but marinated in sub-zero temperatures. For those who do not know, a nor'easter is not an ordinary monsoon. It possesses a hurricane vortex structure with wind from the northeast, enough to turn modern cities into deserted wastelands in just a few hours. This white fury began to vent its anger from January 6th to 10th, creating a massive icy ribbon along the northeast corridor. While the high mountains of West Virginia recorded insane snow accumulation of up to 48 inches, about 1.2 meters, the hearts of America, such as Washington, D.C., Philadelphia, and New York, did not escape the fate of being buried under a layer of snow more than 30 inches thick. The image of the wide avenues of the capital, Washington, suddenly becoming deserted without a single car with only the dim streetlights and the murky snow mist, became a symbol of human helplessness before nature. The paralysis of 1996 had a special shade: the silence of the power apparatus. Snow fell so thick and rapidly that the U.S. federal government had to make a rare decision to close completely for nearly a week. The hallways of power at Capitol Hill or the White House suddenly fell into a state of hibernation. Office workers were trapped at home, flights were canceled en masse, and even the largest-scale shoveling efforts became futile as the snow fell faster than people could clear it. However, the cruelty of the 1996 storm did not stop at the pristine white snowdrifts. Immediately after the frozen days, an unusually warm airstream accompanied by heavy rains poured down on the east. Snow melted too quickly, overloading drainage systems and turning the massive amounts of ice into waterfalls that washed away everything. Water rose from rivers, flooding homes that had just been rescued from the snow, creating a cycle of continuous destruction. The combination of blizzards and historic flooding made this storm twice as terrifying. The final consequence was a painful figure with 154 deaths, concentrated mostly in Virginia, Maryland, and Pennsylvania. Many passed away from exhaustion while trying to dig through snowdrifts around their homes, while others became victims of the fierce floodwaters immediately after. The Great Blizzard of 1996 left a painful lesson in disaster response. We must not only prepare for the attack of ice, but also be ready for the variable consequences immediately following it. Looking back at the footage of 1996, people still cannot help but shudder at the sight of a capital city forced to stop breathing by nature for a whole long week. The Groundhog Day Blizzard of 2011. In American folklore, February 2nd, each year is Groundhog Day. Millions of people glue their eyes to the television screen to see if Punxsutawney Phil sees his shadow, thereby predicting whether spring will arrive early or winter will last another 6 weeks. But in 2011, nature did not have the patience to wait for a groundhog to give an answer. Even as this tradition was taking place, a giant meteorological monster had taken shape, stretching a terrifying ribbon of snow over 3,000 kilometers, sweeping from Texas all the way to Maine, turning the entire Midwest into a deadly white zone. The most devastating highlight of this storm was Chicago, where residents were already used to harsh winters but still shuddered at the aggression of the Groundhog Day storm. In less than 2 days, the city suffered a snowfall of 20 inches, with neighboring areas like Antioch recording a record 27 inches. But snow was not the only enemy. Sustained wind speeds of 60 miles per hour created complete whiteout conditions. In that frozen fog, all urban traffic safety standards vanished into thin air. The most haunting image of 2011 was the vital artery, Lake Shore Drive. In the middle of rush hour, hundreds of drivers suddenly found themselves trapped between walls of snow with no exit. Zero visibility and frozen road surfaces turned miles of highway into a hopeless, massive parking lot. For 12 long hours, those people had to fight the darkness and biting cold inside cars that were gradually being buried by snow. Many had to abandon their vehicles to walk in search of life in the murky night, creating a desolate scene like in global disaster movies. The power of the storm stretched from New Mexico and Oklahoma to New York and Pennsylvania in the form of thick, accumulated ice. The aftermath left 40 people dead, mostly due to chain reaction accidents on slippery roads. In states like Oklahoma and Texas, the storm brought ice rain causing widespread power outages for millions of households. The event of hundreds of drivers being buried alive in their cars for 12 hours on Lakeshore Drive in 2011 forced Chicago to carry out a major overhaul of highway rescue procedures. The most important change was the proactive lockdown mindset. Based on real-time meteorological data, vital routes will be closed as soon as wind speed and snow density reach dangerous thresholds. In terms of technical infrastructure, Chicago installed a series of removable dividers and emergency U-turn points along the route. This allows rescue forces and snowplows to reach the scene from different directions, while creating an exit for vehicles to turn back instead of being stuck in an endless line of cars. In addition, rapid response teams, including heavy tow trucks and medical personnel, are now always pre-positioned at key traffic nodes. The communication system was also comprehensively upgraded through the Office of Emergency Management and Communications, OEMC. These reforms turned the 2011 nightmare into a set of standard operating procedures to protect lives every time the white monster wakes up. Snowzilla 2016. In late January 2016, America welcomed an uninvited guest that the media and residents affectionately gave a powerful name, Snowzilla. Unlike the storms of the past, Snowzilla was the first great blizzard of the exploding social media era, where the power of nature was captured fully through millions of phone lenses and time-lapse videos with millions of views. Taking place from January 22nd to 24th, Snowzilla carried out an all-out attack on the busiest urban corridor of the East Coast. In New York, the heart of the world, Central Park recorded a historic figure, 69.3 centimeters of accumulated snow. This was a new record, breaking the old milestone from 2006 to become the largest blizzard in the city's history since measurements began in 1869. Baltimore was not to be outdone, suffering a record 74 centimeters of snow, turning busy harbors into quiet frozen lands. To deal with this monster, state governors had to declare total travel bans. Times Square, the place that originally never sleeps and is always filled with lights and bustling crowds, suddenly became a white, silent square. The subway system was suspended, flights were canceled en masse, and highways that were originally choking with traffic jams were left with only towering snowdrifts. America was like pressing a pause button on a continental scale. However, the most interesting point of Snowzilla was the strange contrast in social psychology. While the government and older people worried about economic damage and infrastructure safety, a wave of excitement spread strongly among the youth. The concept of Snow Day became a true festival. On social media, the hashtag Snowzilla was filled with creative images, From young people skiing right in the middle of Manhattan's carless avenues to families building giant ice forts in their yards, time-lapse videos recording the scene of an outdoor table on a balcony being swallowed by a thick layer of snow in just a few hours attracted millions of views, turning the fear of natural disasters into awe at the beauty and power of creation. Unlike the ambiguity of previous decades, Snowzilla 2016 was a testament to the dominance of the big data-based meteorological era. The world's leading forecast models like the GFS from America and the ECMWF from Europe simultaneously drew a scenario of a superstorm attacking the East Coast nearly a week in advance, allowing meteorologists to confirm with certainty the path and snowfall of the storm 48 to 72 hours beforehand. It was this golden time that saved thousands of lives, as authorities had enough scientific basis to issue total closure orders for the transportation system. Stories of humanity always warm our hearts. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next emotional historical journeys. Nature can freeze everything, but from that harshness, humans have learned to rise up stronger and more modern. If you love this content, press like and subscribe to the Back to Yesterday channel so you don't miss the next journeys to the past.